All right, so in lecture 7 and 8, I showed you how to use Eclipse. And when we first recorded this 2 years ago, one of the things that was a little bit awkward is that when you would want to run one of the tutorial programs in Eclipse, for example, there was a lot of manual setup. You had to do, let's say, you had to teach Eclipse how to use the right include paths, you had to set up the makefile targets, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I would like to talk about today is that we worked a little bit on making this easier to do. So at least some of the setup that you had to do by hand with Eclipse is something that we can do automatically these days. And I want to show you how this works and how that makes things a lot easier. So this is lecture 8.01. This is an update of lecture 8, essentially. Let's say lecture 7 and 8. The idea is that in the previous lectures, the things that you had to do manually were how to find the header file locations, the deal.II header file locations, how to set up makefile targets, and then when you wanted to run or debug a program, you had to set that up manually as well. And so at least the first two of these things, I can now show you how to do this automatically. So let me show you how this works. So if I go to a directory where I have one of these tutorial programs, so I'm just going to do this in my own installation here. So here's the directories of all of the tutorial programs, and I'm just going to pick one, let's say step 6. So this is how these look. And what I showed you before is that you would run cmake to create a makefile. So the idea was that you say cmake dot, so dot for the current directory, that's where the sources of the project that you want to configure are in. And then if this was not clear to cmake, you could say -d for define deal.II directory equals, and then you would specify the path to it, which in my case is this one here, dot. So you run cmake, and it creates a makefile. Now this is not the deal.II dir is what I needed. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, better. So it creates a makefile here that describes, let's say, the what commands need to be executed to compile and to run the step 6 executable. So I can say, for example, make, and then I can say make run. Now, cmake knows all of the information that you need in order to, let's say, compile something. So it knows where the header files are, and it knows where include paths, it knows what the targets are, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that we should be able to do is to extract this sort of information from cmake and explain it to Eclipse. So I would like to show this to you. And in order to do this, let me just call cmake by hand. And what you see here is when you just call cmake with no arguments at all, it shows you all of the arguments that you could specify. And one of these is called -g generator name, and it says specify a build system generator. Now, the names of the possible generators are listed at the very bottom here. So what I'm going to do is I don't need to call cmake twice. Let me just reset the whole thing to the original state, make this clean. So we're back where we were. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call cmake as before, but I'm also going to specify the -g flag. And then what I would like to do is I would like to choose this one here, Eclipse CDT Unix makefiles. So this was in the section on generators. Okay. Now this string here has spaces, and so what I need to do is I need to enclose them down here on the command line in double quotes. Okay. So what this does is it sets up an Eclipse project in addition to a makefile project. So if you do ls-l, here's my makefile. You don't see anything about Eclipse, but I can get this if I output also files that start with a dot, so ls-la. And so you see that there's a file .project and .c project. These are Eclipse files. Okay. So I've already started Eclipse because this usually takes a little while. Now let me remind you how we originally set up projects. So I usually set new, and then I said project, makefile project with existing code, next, and I wanted to choose Linux GCC. That's in order to learn, let's say, where header files like vector or set or IOStream are. And then I say browse, and then I go to the directory where I am right now, which is a little bit down. You see that when you do development, you have multiple directories where you install all of these sort of things. So it is in example step 6. Okay, so I say OK, and then I say finish. And then I came up with a new Eclipse project, but Eclipse only learns what it can get from the makefile, which is basically nothing. So this is going to take a little while, I'm afraid. Let me see. So it is rebuilding the workspace. So if I go to step 6, I can load the .cc file, and what you see is all of these errors here. Okay, all of these errors are because it doesn't know anything. So let's say it doesn't know about the class FE_values. Okay, so if I hover over it, it says it can't resolve it. That's because Eclipse doesn't know where to find this class FE_values. I showed this to you to illustrate, let's say, the problem that you get into, but also because I've gotten a lot of questions about something that surprised me a little in the beginning, but I understand, I think, where that's coming from. So when you see all of these errors in Eclipse, I get questions that say, well, so if Eclipse shows these as errors, doesn't that mean that my program is buggied? That's a fair question. The answer is actually no. So what really matters is if the compiler understands your code. Eclipse is just an editor, a very smart editor, but it's really just an editor. And so if Eclipse does not understand your code, for example, because it doesn't know where to find the header files and so on and so forth, then that's annoying because Eclipse cannot help you with, let's say, autocompletion or with telling you about the arguments to a particular function. But in the end, it's not a killer argument. It has nothing to do with the fact that your program will not compile. And that's because Eclipse being an editor, but not being a compiler, means it just tries to understand the code, but the thing that really matters is if the compiler understands the code. So when I go back to the command line and I say, for example, let's say if I would say make, that's what calls the compiler, and that's what really matters. So the fact that I get all of these squiggles here, this is annoying, but it does not mean that your code is wrong. It just means that the editor does not understand your code, right? So these are separate things. I understand where that question comes from because in some environments, for example, Microsoft Visual Studio, the compiler and the editor are actually more or less the same thing. And in that case, if you get errors in the source code, that, or let's say if your editor shows you errors in the source code, that would really mean that there is an error in the program. For Eclipse and the compiler, these are separate programs that both should ideally understand the code, but the only one that really matters is the compiler that you call. Okay, so let's get back here. So you remember that we could resolve these sort of things if I right-click on the project here and I go to Properties and I go to C, C++ General. I could, here in the paths and symbols, this is where I could add the path to deal.II. I'm not going to do this because I wanted to show you a much better way to do this. And so in order to do that, let me close this here and let me get rid of this project again. So delete. Okay, I'm going to say delete this project. So what I showed you was the manual way where I just tell Eclipse, okay, so create a new project and oh yeah, here are some source files. But we told CMake to produce these Eclipse project files. So what I really should be doing is not create a new project, but to import the project that Eclipse had set up for us. So if I go to import and then existing code as a makefile project, okay, I say next. Let me choose let me see if this works. So back in my home directory, p deal.II 1 install examples step 6. Okay, so I'm going to say OK. Now this was not what I wanted. Let me try this again. So import. Here, this is of course what I want. Existing projects into workspace. I didn't want an existing code, I want an existing project, namely the one that CMake set up for me. Okay, so I get a different dialog, browse. Let's try this again. So I wanted to go into the step 6 directory. Okay, so I'm in that. I say OK. Okay, and now it says, okay, so in this directory I can find this project, step 6 debug at step 6, whatever that means. I'm going to say sure. So I check this. I say finish. Okay. And now this is going to take a long time of indexing this. So if I go up here, I can get to see the, oh, it's already done. I'm surprised. Okay, very good. So if I go to the step 6 source files here, okay, so with some luck, it now knows about all of these classes. No, it doesn't. What happened here? Okay, that stumps me because that used to work. Let me close Eclipse and let me try. So I'm afraid that happened because I first created an Eclipse project in this directory. I'm just going to do the same thing again in the step 7 directory. I'm going to start Eclipse in the background. We're going to run CMake again in this directory, and we're going to try this again. Okay, so ls minus la. There is the project, the dot project, the .c project. Now let's wait what Eclipse does. That unfortunately takes a little while. So just to give you an idea how these files look like. So if you look at the make file, for example, these are the files that explain what you need to do, or let's say what commands you have to execute if you want to, let's say, compile something. Okay, so you see this is sort of difficult text to understand, and even, let's say, if Eclipse tries to do it, it doesn't quite succeed in getting, let's say, the name of the compiler, the name of the let's say the arguments to be passed, and so on and so forth. So that's why it's useful to have CMake explain how this works. Okay, so let's try this again. So right-click here, import, and so existing projects into workspace. Okay, browse. So I want to go install example step 7. Okay. So the step 7 project, that's the one that Eclipse produced for me. Say finish. I don't need the step 6 source file anymore, but I'm just going to take the step 7 source file. Okay. Okay, so this is going to show lots of errors right now, but I can tell you why. It's because Eclipse is still hard at work at indexing my whole project. So indexing the whole project means that CMake explained where all of the header files are. So it knows these header files, but it hasn't quite read the source code of these header files yet. So you see that, for example, all of these classes that we want to use, let me show you an example here. Let's say triangulation, it doesn't know about this yet, okay? But it's working on it down here. So in the meantime, I'm going to show you what it also did. So it created for me all of these targets that are in the make file. So these I had to set up by hand before, But what I can do, for example, is, let's say if I open my console view here, okay, let me double click, for example, on all, and you will see that it builds with minus J8, because I have 8 cores on my machine. It builds the source file, okay? And so this is when it actually calls the compiler. The compiler is user bin C++ on my system, okay? So it knows how to build things now, okay? And I can also call clean or disclean or all of these other targets here. In particular, I could run strip comments, okay, here. So you see that all of these makefile targets that before I had to set up by hand, they're now all there, okay? So I can say make run, for example, and it's going to execute the program, okay? So yeah, it does something. I don't need to wait here. Let me stop this. Okay, so the only thing that's still running is the indexer. It's up to 81% now. One of the things that might be interesting to do is get rid of all of these comments. You remember that if I say make strip comments, all of the comments disappear. Okay, so in my editor window now it looks a lot cleaner. I can actually read the code and not be distracted by all of the comments that are in there. Okay, so in the meantime, apparently the indexer has gotten far enough in that in this whole source file, you see that there's only a small number of errors left. Okay, so it knows about the tensor class, for example. Okay, or many of the other things. So let's say if you want to go to the triangulation, where do we have that here? If I hover my mouse over the triangulation, I get a help text for this. Okay, so a lot of this stuff is automatically set up if only I say cmake minus g and then the name of the generator. Okay, so let's briefly see what these four are. They're okay. So FAQ. Apparently, we forgot to include the appropriate header file for this. That sometimes throws off Eclipse. Now we actually do this here. So some of the things apparently Eclipse does not quite understand, but almost everything it does. And like I explained, the issue of Eclipse understanding it is not actually the important part. What really matters is that the compiler understands it. And apparently here, it's not even that Eclipse doesn't understand that what FAQ is. It knows it. It just thinks that it is a function, a class that is not properly declared. Well, it turns out that Eclipse is wrong in this case. But you get to see all of the other things here seem to be working just fine. Okay, so I think that's sort of what I wanted to show you, that there's a much easier way of doing this, and that not everything that we've done by hand before is something that really needs to be done by hand.